Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 10 and the battle for southern Canaan. Back in chapter 9, verse 1, we read sort of an introduction to that whole section. It came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan and the hill country and the lowlands and all the coasts of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, when they all heard of what Joshua had done, they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight against Joshua and with Israel. But we haven't seen any fighting yet take place. But now we get to chapter 10, verse 1. Now it came about, notice there's a similarity in the way these two chapters begin. Now it came about when Adonizedek, and that's an interesting name, Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem. It's an interesting name because there had been a different king back in the pages of Genesis called Melchizedek. Adonizedek, Adonai just means Lord. Zedek is of righteousness, Lord of righteousness. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. It almost sounds like that maybe there's a little bit of a connection there. And yet it's not a spiritual connection, because Melchizedek had been a priest of the Most High God. This Adonizedek, he's actually going to be against the people of the Most High God. And yet, here he is, king of Jerusalem. See, Jerusalem was a Canaanite city back then. It was not a godly city. And so here's Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem. He heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king. But now he's heard what happened in chapter 9, that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land. And so now notice, in chapter 9, the result was they gathered together to fight. Chapter 10, verse 2, that he feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. You know, this is a bigger threat, but the result is going to be the same. He's going to gather other cities together, and they're going to fight. So in chapters 6 through 8, we had first the taking of Jericho, and then Ai. Now in chapter 9, we had the deception of Gibeon, and Gibeon has gone over to the Israelite side, and that kicks off what we're going to see now in chapter 10, where there will be a Jerusalem coalition. And of course, I'm sort of giving it away at the end. Notice the sun and moon are going to stand still. Of course, you know that's coming in chapter 10, but let's read about it. So chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, we have this situation where Adonizedek has heard what's happened. Verse 2, he feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, and now he's going to raise up a number of cities against, well, not against Israel yet. It's going to be against these new allies of Israel. It's going to be against Gibeon, because Gibeon's a great city. They figure, let's start with the folks that have defected, will prevent any others, and then we'll take care of Israel when we're able. So Gibeon, now I'm giving you an approximate location. We think we may have found Gibeon. We're not entirely sure. Jericho we're pretty sure of. Gilgal have a pretty good idea. Gibeon, like Ai, is going to be some guesswork, but probably about 6 miles to, if we're correct, about 6 miles to the northwest of Jerusalem. And so here was the ancient city of Gibeon that had now gone over to the side of the Israelites. And Jerusalem, the king of Jerusalem, is going to gather a number of other cities, Jarmuth and Lachish and Eglon and Hebron. These will be a coalition of cities which are now going to come up against Gibeon. Chapter 10, verse 5, so the 5 kings of the Amorites, and here they are again, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, they gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and camped by Gibeon, and fought against it. Verse 6, then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, do not abandon your servants. Remember that covenant we've just entered into. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. Notice Amorites, that's really just another word for Canaanites. Chapter 10, verse 9, so Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. It's a good-sized march. And also it's not in a straight line, sort of up and down. You're going through the mountains. And so even though Joshua was trusting in the Lord, Joshua, that doesn't stop him from exercising some military tactics, making a forced night march, and who knows, maybe even attacking before sunrise. We're not told that. But verse 10, and the Lord confounded them before Israel. Even though Joshua was doing his part, he's leading the Israelites, he's leading them on a forced march, all night march, so that he would come up upon them by surprise. Yet we read in verse 10, the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon. Now Beth-horon is one of the passes that leads down toward the ocean, and it's protected by Gibeon. But Gibeon sort of oversees that pass. And he pursued them by way of the ascent of Beth-horon and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And so here, notice you've got Beth-horon to the little bit to the northwest of Gibeon. And Joshua marches all night to get there, and now he attacks, and he sends those attackers on. He puts them on the defensive at Upper Beth-horon and chases them all the way down past Azekah and Makkedah. So he's chasing them back to their turf. That's where they're running. Verse 11, as they fled from before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth-horon, the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah. That's a long period. That's not just a small little tiny place. It's over a large area, and they died. And there were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Again, let's look at our map again, and notice from Beth-horon all the way down to Azekah. That's a large area of maybe 20 miles or so. And this entire area is now an area of God's wrath, God's anger, God's judgment. God comes and fights for Israel. Israel is chasing this enemy, and yet there were more killed by God dropping stones on them. Are they hailstones? Are they rocks? Are they both? But more are killed by that than the actual war that takes place. Now chapter 10, verse 12. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, in other words, everyone heard him. It wasn't like, he claims this after the fact. And it's almost given by way of poetry. O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon. Verse 13, so the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. And then how sometimes you are writing something and you want to make sure that you sort of back it up with historical fact, and so what do? You footnote it. You give an outside source, and that's what the book of Joshua does here. It's middle of verse 13. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? Now, we don't have the book of Jasher, but apparently they had back then this other book called the book of Jasher that was an independent witness, an independent testimony to what took place. And it could be that this song, this piece of poetry, is actually brought to us from the book of Jasher. I don't know. We don't have the book of Jasher, but we have by way of explanation. And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Joshua continues, verse 14. There was no day like that before it or after it when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. And that's not saying God has never answered prayer before or after, but there was something special about this prayer that made it a unique situation. Now, as we read about how the sun stood still and the moon did not hasten to go down, there's been a few different interpretations that have been suggested by scholars. First of all, the poetic interpretation says that, and it points out, and this is true, that the phrase "stand still" can be translated "be silent." Sometimes we say "stop there," and what we mean, given the context, if you're talking, well, stop there. Don't say anything else. But it can have both meanings. But notice we're also told it wasn't just the sun; the moon also stood still, so that it was directed at the sun and the moon. And it's been suggested that, well, yes, maybe this is sort of poetic, or maybe the sun is being called to shine more brightly, or maybe the sun is being told, don't shine so brightly. In other words, sort of, it's too hot, it's going to be a long day. Can you sort of give us some cloud cover? But that's not the natural reading of the text. And when we consult our Hebrew friends, the Hebrew scholars, they say, if you just read it for what it says exactly the same thing our English translation has rendered it. That the literal interpretation is that the sun stopped. And notice, then we have a second description, just in case we don't understand the first one. The sun did not hasten to go down. But that brings up the question, and I'm not sure it's a question we can answer. I don't have the answer to it. Was this something localized, or did it affect the entire planet? And I'm going to be quite frank. I don't know. I don't know how God did it. There are times when we have a miracle in the Bible. For example, the parting of the Red Sea. We're told that God sent an east wind, and it was the wind that divided the waters, which means it wasn't this tiny little tunnel through the Red Sea, sometimes the way we pictured it in movies, but probably very, very sort of broad. We call that, in Florida, we call that tidal surge, when the wind sort of moves the water. Usually it's moving it in our direction. Usually we're having flooding as a result. But we're told in Exodus that it was the wind that caused the parting of the sea. Here we're not told how God did it. But it is interesting to note, and I just say this by way of observation, that we've just read that not only did the sun and moon stop, not only did the sun not hasten to go down, it sounds like the day was lengthened, but also we read about both hail and stones coming from heaven and killing more people in that than in the actual battle. Have you ever been in a car where you're driving along and then you slam on the brakes? And mind you, I don't think we're talking about slamming on the brakes of the Earth, per se, because the Earth at its equator is moving 1,000 miles an hour. That's really fast. But any change in that, you're driving along and you slam on the brakes, and if you have something sitting next to you on the front seat, it's gonna get moved off to the floor. It's gonna go sliding around. And here we have rocks falling from heaven. Now, I don't know that it's related, and the Bible doesn't say it's related, so I don't want to jump to that conclusion. It's just a simple observation that both events are described within the space of a few verses and take place at the same time. I find that interesting. Well, to continue, Joshua chapter 10, verse 16, now these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave at Makkedah. And it was told Joshua, saying, the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. And Joshua said, verse 18, Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave, and assign men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them in the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hands. So you're going to try to capture these armies before they get home and set themselves up behind high city walls, high city gates. You're going to try to sort of take down that army so that it can't just turn around and come and attack again. But these kings just take a stone, seal up the cave, and guard it. Don't let them come out. Verse 22, once the battle is over, Joshua comes back, and verse 22, then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave, and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. And they did so, and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. The 5 kings from these 5 cities are brought out. Verse 24, when they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. Now that had to take a long time. Each warrior would come up and put his foot on the neck of one of these kings. So they came near and put their feet on their necks. And what's taking place here is they're showing that God has given you the victory, because this is a sign of the victorious conquest. We actually have wall paintings. That's why I showed this little sort of drawing here. It's taken from a Assyrian wall painting, where the victorious king would come, and the one who had been subjugated, the king would put his foot upon the neck of the vanquished foe. And here are all the Israelites, and they are playing the part of kings under God. And it reminds us of something that we later read about in the book of Psalms. Psalm chapter 110 is the Psalm of David, where the Lord says to my Lord, is David speaking, and David says, I heard this heavenly conversation going on. The Lord, and notice the first word Lord there is in all caps. That is, it's the name of God. We could say, Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until, here's what I'm going to do, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Of course, the Jewish people recognize this is a messianic psalm, and that this psalm was speaking of the son of David, because that's who Messiah is, and yet the son of David is called David's Lord. That's sort of an interesting riddle, but we're not going to go into that right now. Notice the point is that the Messiah will one day have his enemies as a footstool for his feet. But not only that, when we get to the book of Romans, Romans chapter 16, verse 20, we have this promise that the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. You see, because we've been united to Christ through faith, to that Jewish Messiah, even though a lot of us are Jewish, yet we've been united by faith to that Messiah. As he won the victory, so also we will, and notice it's future tense, we will win a victory over our enemy, over our accuser, over the Satan, the enemy, the adversary. Well, to finish up, Joshua chapter 10, verse 25, Joshua then said to them, do not fear or be dismayed. There's those regular words we've read before. Be strong and courageous. Remember how the book started? And here it is again, this call to be strong and courageous. For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight. It's a promise to them. I think it's a promise to us as well. Verse 26, so afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. And it came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into a cave where they had hidden themselves, and put large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. Notice he's not going to leave them on the tree. That would put a curse, not a curse on the men, a curse on the land. And doesn't want a curse on the land. And so they're brought down and they're buried in that very cave. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22-23 talks about that whole idea if a man has committed sin worthy of death and he's put to death, and you hang him on a tree, which happened here. His corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged on is a curse of God. Notice, but it's so that it's not for the protection of the person. It's so that you do not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So they're taken down not for their sake, but for the sake of the land. So Joshua now goes ahead and captures Makkedah and Libnah, and these are some additional cities. Now, Lachish we've already read about. The king of Gezer comes and tries to intervene, and he's defeated as well. Eglon we mentioned, Hebron we mentioned, Debir, here's a new city. A number of cities that are captured by Joshua. Do you notice which one's not mentioned? Jerusalem isn't mentioned. And so these various cities that are mentioned, Joshua has captured. We have Makkedah, and we have Libnah, and we have Lachish. And king of Gezer, he comes in and tries to intervene, and Eglon and Hebron. Not Jerusalem. Jerusalem we're not going to see captured at this time. In fact, Jerusalem will continue to be Canaanite. And even though some of these other cities are captured, some of them will regain their independence and continue to be Canaanite cities. But Jerusalem is going to be a Canaanite city until the days of King David. Debir, left out. Chapter 10, verse 40. Then thus Joshua struck all the land, and the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowlands, and the slopes, and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea, that's in the south, as far as Gaza, that's to the west, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon, that whole southern area Joshua, he wins the victory. Doesn't mean everybody has now disappeared. There are still Canaanites in the land, but the armed forces have been defeated in this battle. Verse 42, Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. Now, as we close, remember those kings that are defeated by Joshua, that are taken and first hung and then buried. In Joshua chapter 10, we read about these kings who gather to make war on the people of God. When we get to the book of Revelation, it's striking that we read in Revelation chapter 19, verse 19, where John sees this vision of the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Sort of reminds us a little bit of the Joshua story, and I think it's supposed to. In Joshua 10, we see hailstones fall from the sky and kill the enemies of God. In the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verse 21, we read about huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, come down from heaven upon men. In Joshua chapter 10, we read of the sun and the moon standing still. In the book of Revelation, we read in Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 and following, where the sixth seal is broken and there was a great earthquake, and the sun doesn't stand still. It says the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to earth. These cataclysmic happenings being described in the book of Revelation, almost like it's a return to the days of Joshua. In Joshua chapter 10, we read about the defeated kings hiding in a cave. And again in Revelation chapter 6, we read of the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and freeman hiding themselves in the caves and upon the rocks of the mountains. It's almost a repetition, an echo from the days of Joshua. And in this vision, John sees God doing it again to and for his people. It reminds us of the one who was hidden in a cave, after all he died, and was buried, and a stone rolled into place, and even guards placed there to make sure he didn't escape. And yet the third day he rose from the dead, the stone was rolled away, the guards rendered, according to Matthew's account, like dead men, because he has won the victory for us. And that is our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.